Welcome to Salvage, a podcast for conversations with artists about the repurposed materials they use in their art practice. Please enjoy my conversation with Niki Lederer. Discarded and found objects are Niki's starting point. She makes sculptures from repurposed umbrellas and post-consumer plastic that she harvests from curbside recycling, garbage cans, and the street. Niki finds the colors intoxicating and can't resist collecting them. The sheer volume of recyclables and broken umbrellas creates an endless and an overwhelming supply of material. Back in the studio, Niki processes her finds by thoroughly cleaning them and removing all branding on bottles and armatures from the umbrellas. Then she dissects these materials so she can reconfigure them to make sculptures. Well, Niki, thank you so much for agreeing to chat with me. I am delighted that you were up for this.
Yeah, I'm excited that you asked me. Thank you for asking me. It was fun to show together a little bit earlier, I guess at the end of last year. So it's been fun to get to know your work and you in person. So it'll be good to chat today. I'm looking forward to it.
I think so. So to fill in our listeners, we were exhibiting together in the exhibit called Plastic Culture. And I have been well, first of all, I'm so pleased to be exhibiting with you and all the other artists in this artists that I have admired for so long. But also, how perfect is that? I have all these artists to interview for my podcast now.
Yeah, I think it's so exciting. You know, we were in that exhibition together, and all of the artists in the show use plastic in some way or another. And what I thought was so interesting was how many variations on incorporating plastic into an art practice there could be. So I know for myself that I'm very deeply invested in certain types of plastic. So it's always exciting to see people using other means of putting those materials together, because it's almost as if I'm using plastic as if it was a material that I would buy ready-made and ready to go, but I just think about this one source. So it's always inspiring to see other ways that people are putting plastics together to kind of open up, you know, your practice and the aesthetic approach, I guess.
Definitely. And the wide range of the materials too. Like it's mind-boggling how many different plastics there are and how many different ways everyone can use them.
Yeah, it's true. And when you start to think about plastics, like where they feature in our day-to-day lives, like if you're in your own setting right now listening or doing something in the morning and looking around, everything you encounter is created with the material. So it might be a toothbrush, and then it might be, you know, something in the kitchen that you're using, like the frother to make your coffee might have a plastic handle. So it feels almost inescapable. And
It is.
and now trying to sort of look for other options to switch out those materials, I guess, is a focus of some manufacturing. But still, it's been, I don't know, like 60 years of plastic, maybe longer, in the consumer space. And even with recycling, there's just so much available, I think, even as people start to switch out. So it's everywhere.
We will not be lacking our materials anytime soon. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. And I think that's how I got started. It was seeing so much material everywhere. Always,
So let me ask you a question before we get to the question of how you found plastic for your practice. I'm assuming that you were an artist as a kid, since you got a BFA and an MFA and you're an art teacher now.
Yeah, as a kid, I was always very, I guess, object and dimensionally oriented. Like I remember in school, there were a lot of students who drew very well and would make a lot of pictures. And then that would be the student that everybody asked, can you draw this for me? Or can you draw that for me? And I wasn't really that person. When they called on me to draw something for them, it wasn't really up my alley. I like to, right from the get-go, make make three-dimensional objects. So my first, I guess, main project would have been a fort that I built in the backyard. So
Oh,
I grew up in the suburbs of Canada, and it was a new subdivision. So there were a lot of homes being built, and I would scour the neighborhood for building materials, leftover building materials, and then I
so you
was
were a
putting
scavenger
together,
from the start.
yeah, I was putting together a fort in the backyard. So I guess that would have been uh, middle school age. I started to put things together, and I really enjoyed the tools and sort of the weight of the materials and the scale of it. It made me feel very activated in a way that working in regular materials or at a desk, I didn't like it as much. So I think that looking at it now or thinking about it now, it seems really clear. But at the time, I didn't understand that that was like an option to make work or to practice as an artist without drawing, because that's sort of traditionally what you learn about in school,
Right. Yeah.
and people around you.
So when you went to get your BFA, what was your concentration?
Yeah, I went to school at the University of Victoria because I grew up in Vancouver. And my concentration was photography and sculpture. The time in Vancouver, the Vancouver school was emerging. So it was artists like Jeff Wall working with conceptual photography and large scale duotrans, like advertising scale and materials of presenting photography. So that was really foremost in the environment and what I was understanding as art making. And the aesthetic at that time was, postmodernism and paying attention to how materials were put together. So studying sculpture there on the West Coast was really interesting. So my focus there was on sculpture and photography. I wasn't really drawing very much, though you have to always do that in a foundation class, and a little bit of painting, which was, those products are quite horrible, but still exist here and there. I see them once in a while when I go home to visit, how your parents will keep a painting or two, but it was really objects from the get-go. And I think one of the really interesting things about studying there was one of the professors we had, or actually two of the sculpture professors we had, took us on a field trip to the dump where, the dump. So the whole sculpture class went to the dump,
That's
and
so
we were allowed,
exciting.
it was so exciting. We were allowed to select materials, and we could select kind of large materials because the sculpture prof had a large truck that he welded out of. It was a mobile welding truck,
Oh,
because
wow.
he made public artwork like that. So he took us and we got to select some things, and we brought them back to the studio at the school, and we were allowed to make work. So it was normalized right from the beginning in my
Mhm.
practice. This was an expected, normal way to make work and put materials together. So I thought that was really interesting when I look back now to kind of approach it in that way. There wasn't, it wasn't really a urban type of center. You're on Vancouver Island on the coast of Canada. It's not like a lot of detritus that you would see in a much urban setting. And people are
Right.
quite careful about litter and managing materials. So recycling and all of those ways of managing waste were prevalent then. Like in the mid 90s, it was pretty active. So
Mhm.
it wasn't like you could see a lot of things strewn about.
Right. That's so cool. I went to the dump for the very first time this past summer.
I haven't been to the dump since.
Oh, really?
I always think, oh, it would be, I'm very careful about going because it must have been, I mean, I don't know, you can tell me, but when you went, I wouldn't know how to edit what my selections were. A
I
lot of
guess you have to
materials.
go in with a project in mind or like an idea at least in mind.
Right. And
Yeah.
when you went to the dump, like, just because I haven't been here, so I don't know, it's like, you park somewhere and you're allowed to walk around, or?
So this dump was in Aspen. So I'm not sure it's like any other dumps around here. I haven't been to a dump in New York. Actually, come to think of it, I have been to a dump in Vermont, and that was very spare. They're very good at recycling there, but I wasn't there looking for art supplies. The dump in Aspen, I was looking for art supplies, and their dump was rather curated. Like there was portion on this side that was just like a pile of everything dumped. And
Yeah.
then there was a portion on the other side where things were sort of separated, and there was even a little shop
Wow.
of smaller things indoor. Like there were, the outside was like these containers, like truck containers,
Hmm.
that were all separate. Like furniture was in one thing, like all hockey sticks were in another one,
Oh,
all
wow.
golf bags were in another one, like sort of separated like that. And
Yeah.
then in the shop were the little tchotchkes and books and things like that. I mean,
Hmm.
everything was, I think I spent $20 and I got like a big bucket full of supplies. And I
Wow.
went
That's.
specifically looking for just plastic things.
Hmm. Hmm.
So it was interesting. Yeah, I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. I'm always curious that maybe I should try it out, but I've sort of been careful and cautious, but maybe that's something I'll think about.
Oh, well, maybe we can like combine and go together. It'll
Yeah.
be
Take a field
an
trip.
adventure.
Field trip to the dump.
Yeah. So did you go on to your MFA right after you finished your BFA?
Yeah, I did. It was I was applying to a lot of schools from Victoria, and you had to send slide carousels out. So each application was about, I don't know, 200, $250. It was pretty arduous, and
Oh,
I really wanted to go to the East Coast because, I'd grown up on the West Coast and had a sense of that and wanted something different, a little bit of a change. So I'd applied to a lot of schools in Canada for graduate school, and I wasn't accepted anywhere,
oh.
which was a little bit devastating for me. I was surprised that I wasn't able to do um, a solid enough application to get into graduate school. So I had applied to Hunter College. Somebody from our program, undergraduate program, had gone the year before, and just as a long shot. And then they called for an interview, and three of us went out from Victoria to go to interview at Hunter College, and that's how I ended up coming to New York. Just
That's
by a
awesome.
whim. I was like, oh, I'll just go to school and then I'll come back. But um, I came out to New York, and it was such a different change that it helped fuel kind of creative ideas.
Mhm.
Like it was enough of a difference that I really was excited by the environment and wanted to stay. So that was quite a few decades ago at this point. And
Yeah.
I haven't really wanted to go back. So that's how I sort of traveled through the MFA program and got to graduate school at Hunter and landed in New York. So I think sometimes, you know, when you're challenged with these directions that don't quite go where you think they will, they can be very fruitful, if you can tolerate the disappointment, the initial disappointment. I was really quite devastated on some level about it
Hmm.
and defeated because obviously, in Canada there aren't as many programs to apply for.
Hmm.
It wasn't like there were hundreds of MFA programs. There were a couple really solid programs, and if you didn't get in, it was sort of, you know, it was a little bit embarrassing, I
Yeah,
guess
no, I can
I'd say.
imagine. But I'm so glad you wound up in New York, and I can totally understand how New York could fuel an art practice and take it into maybe even a completely different direction.
Yeah, I mean, I remember coming to New York with our undergraduate class because we were quite isolated in terms of being able to see contemporary work. So one advantage being there because we were on the West Coast is that we had artists come up from LA, which was really quite exciting because they were friends with people who taught there. So we had um, Charles Ray come up, for example, and then we had Nancy Rubens. That was very influential for me, for Nancy Rubens to come up. She was making those, at that time they were absolutely unseen of before, enormous sculptures put together like used canoes or different huge materials.
Oh, how
That
cool.
was really exciting to see. But coming to New York, you could see sculptural works in galleries, and there wasn't that kind of a market or a system where I'd come from. So it was a whole new way to be able to look at work. I mean, galleries were still in Soho. You would see famous people at openings. It was sort of a smaller sense of New York in a way. I guess it was before you could see things online. So
Hmm.
it was really, it was electric when you could see work in person. I remember seeing some of the really early works that influenced me at that time to think that I went to see Robert Gober's work in Soho, as an exhibiting artist, not as a museum show, was pretty exciting. So that
Yeah.
was the kind of moment when I first arrived, and it was interesting to see, just work out and around really normalized. That would have never happened where I was going to school before. So that was really exciting.
Yeah, that's really cool. So what kind of artwork were you making in grad school?
Yeah, in graduate school, I was making things that were, um, because I wasn't able to really go and get materials in the way I had in the undergraduate school. And the studios were quite different. Like in undergraduate school, we had a full-time lab technician and things were quite catered. And if you wanted to find a piece of steel rod and thread it into a screw, we had all the technology for that and the machinery for that. But at Hunter, it was a little bit DIY. There weren't like tech shops. So it was a very different approach to putting objects together. And at scale, you had to use materials that, might be, you had to move them around on the subway. I remember taking like long pieces of conduit metal on the subway, like on the A train, and nobody had said anything about it.
Of
So I
course
was
not.
using materials that were, yeah, construction based, I guess you could say, and then combining those with a lot of materials I was working a lot with materials from Canal Rubber down on
Mm.
Canal Street. So those were materials that could be expanded at large scale, but easy to move around before you had manipulated them in the studio. So it was always this challenge of how to access enough material to make something at a large scale, but be able to move it around without a car on the subway, which to think about now is pretty funny, even though I still schlep a lot of stuff around like that. But um, it wasn't really found material oriented at that time. It was mostly um, materials that were used probably for another application and then put
Hmm.
back together, I
Right.
guess
Yeah.
I would say.
Alternative materials, I guess.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It was a challenge because I didn't have the opportunity to work in that kind of a studio. But the advantage there was that they had a ceramic studio. And
Oh.
so I spent a lot of time in the ceramic studio. That was in their uptown space in the basement of one of the townhouses. I think they might have renovated it since then, but that was a very cozy kind of space in the sense of the bustle of New York, whereas the studios at Hunter downtown were in a building at right beside the Port Authority bus terminal. So they were
Oh.
like hundreds of square feet. These studios were huge and breezy and kind of open. And then in contrast, the ceramic studio was sort of very cozy and intimate. So it was an interesting combination. So I did a lot of ceramic work there, which was fun.
Mhm.
Um, and taking advantage of the opportunity to use the kiln and those types of materials, which I hadn't had before.
Oh,
That
that's
was
fun.
one, thing that was good about the material availability in studios there.
Mm.
That was exciting.
So, from how did you wind up being a teacher at High School of Art and Design after that? My alma mater.
Yeah, the High School of Art and Design has really been a fabulous place to be. That happened kind of in a very long and winding road. Like when I was at Hunter in graduate school, I was still influenced by this approach to photography and sculpture together, like I had been exposed to on the West Coast. So my thesis exhibition was an enormous photograph of a garden in a sort of curated grounds on Leeds Castle in England. I had gone to study hedge mazes and formal gardens. So it was this
Oh,
enormous
cool.
billboard-sized photograph. And at the time, in the late, I guess, late-ish 90s, that photograph cost like over $3,000 to print.
I
And it
can
had to get
imagine.
done in Ohio, like by a billboard company. There was no technology to do that
Oh,
locally.
wow.
And so I started temping in the financial district on Wall Street doing graphic design. And so for my last 6 months at graduate school, I was temping there. And that led after graduation to full-time work to
Mhm.
support my practice. I moved into a studio in Williamsburg after graduating. And I started working in the financial industry, and I worked in that industry for at least like maybe 10, 12 years.
Oh, wow.
And
Doing
we had the
graphic
market.
design.
Yeah, doing graphic design, very sort
Huh.
of low key stuff. And then the market crashed. And I wasn't there, luckily, but I had sort of had a sense that maybe I didn't want to work in the industry anymore. It was a very intense kind of 9 to 5 experience, very formal. You had to sort of wear suits and
Mm.
professional practice. The people were very interesting and exciting and fun to work with, but it was a real challenge. So I was practicing a lot of yoga at the time, and I decided to get trained in hot yoga practice. So I went to Bikram yoga training for 9 weeks in Hawaii. It was like a
Oh,
360
wow.
yeah, it was a 360 from corporate work. And then I taught yoga for a couple years, hoping that it would be helpful to my studio practice, not have this kind of really taxing kind of job. But what I found was I wasn't really having the energy to work. I really like the teaching part of it. And so
Hmm.
that's what led me to teaching. I thought, well, maybe I should focus on teaching. My brother was a art teacher and my mom was a librarian. So I said, oh, well, let me investigate this a little bit, even though I had resisted for so long.
Hmm.
And I was well advanced in my career at this point. I wasn't exactly a young person, but I went back to Brooklyn College and I got a
Oh.
teaching certificate. And then I started teaching at a public high school on the Upper East Side. And I worked there for the first 6 years of teaching. And then I wanted to make a switch into a more art focus. And I was very lucky that this job opened up at the High School of Art and Design. So I teach art history there. And it's been a really engaging environment. The students are very exciting, and you're sort of in the center, you're just a couple blocks down from the MoMA, and
Hmm.
it just kind of keeps it alive in you. Whereas I felt like even when I was doing graphic design, it felt very separate from my
Hmm.
art practice, and this kind of feels a little bit more integrated. So it's been really interesting. I think also working with younger people helps you stay a little bit out of your own worries and mindset. There might be moments where you're not feeling completely, enthusiastic about the current situation or whatever is happening, but because you're working with young people and sort of questioning different things and learning, it helps you kind of stay activated. So I really enjoy that part of it. Though sometimes it can be quite tiring. So it's
Yes.
sort of an interesting ebb and flow. But I think that um, I feel very fortunate to be able to work with young people and to be able to work with different people from different boroughs and experiences and demographics that I wouldn't have experienced otherwise. So I think in that way it's helped me have a much better sense of New York. I think when you're working in a corporate job in New York, it's a very small sliver of how the city
Absolutely.
works.
Yeah.
And so I think I feel very lucky in that way. I don't know if I initially would have said, that's how I felt about it because it's so hard to get a handle on teaching. But I think that I'm happy that I landed in that space because teenagers can be pretty funny.
Yes, they can be. I have to say, I still frequently refer back to my time as a student at High School of Art and Design. It was just, for me, I think partially it was freedom because I grew up in Queens,
Yeah,
and as soon as I found out I could apply to a specialized high school in New York City, and I got in, it was like freedom. I
yeah,
took the subway all by myself. I left my
yep,
parents behind. Obviously I still lived at home, but I could spend the entire day in the city. And
yeah,
to me, the freedom of that was huge. But
yeah.
also, it was like a playground. Yeah, still had to do math and English, but otherwise it was just a playground. I could do so much. We had
It's true.
I did fashion illustration as my major.
Hmm.
And we had a totally, totally kooky teacher, Mrs. Galati. I'll never forget her. She would like sneak us out of school and we would go down the street to Bonwit Teller and draw the windows at Bonwit
Hmm.
Teller.
Yeah, of course.
I
And
mean,
I think what's so interesting about the location, and it's very similar now, the students will go on walking trips and it's all very localized because it's in Midtown. So it helps students like engage, they study architecture or fashion like you did and all these different aspects of it. So it's really exciting to always be immersed in that creative pursuit. I feel very lucky in that way.
yeah,
It's been exciting. And when I started teaching at the High School of Art and Design, my practice really shifted.
I was just
And
gonna ask.
yeah, I think how you described somehow this freedom of it, it was similar for me somehow arriving in this space. There was a freedom, to really fully acknowledge who I was, where I felt, previously, maybe I was teaching art, but you weren't in a cohort of similar people.
Hmm.
And we always joke at the school that, everybody finds their own there. So everybody has their own tribe or clan of very similar types of people. So it's interesting to work because there's 25 art teachers in the department, and we work together, and it's sort of an easier way to express. So my work became very large in scale at that time. And right about the time I switched to that school, I moved from a studio I had on Metropolitan Avenue in Williamsburg, right by the water, right by Domino's Sugar Factory. So there
Hmm.
was a long time when I was working in that studio and the factory was still active. So there would be a couple times a day where they would let the steam out of the factory system so you could smell. It was sort of like a burnt sugar caramelized aroma would come
Right.
out from Domino, and it would waft right into the studio, which was always kind of fun. But I guess after about 20 years and I mean, that's unheard of it to have a same studio for 20 years, but the building changed hands. It's still the only building that hasn't been renovated in that
Oh,
area at Metropolitan and Kent in Williamsburg. They're still sitting on it. It's just empty. They do movie shoots there, but it hasn't been converted. And then I moved down the street, down Metropolitan, closer towards the ISCP on Morgan, and I moved into a studio with no windows.
no
And it was so
windows.
weird. It had no windows, and it was very, very, very tall, like 15 feet high. It was like a little box, but really long. And
Huh.
that's when I started making that really elongated tall work. So I started working with plastic bottles, and I was making standalone sculptures that were maybe my scale. But the
But wait,
advantage
wait,
of
wait, wait,
this
wait. How did you get to the plastic bottles? How did start happening?
that happened when I was teaching Bikram, actually, when I was teaching hot yoga in the neighborhood, because there's so many plastic bottles that students would use during class, and we would recycle them. So there were these bags and bags and bags of plastic bottles outside the studio, and that's how I started collecting bottles. So I was using clear bottles in the beginning and doing
Oh,
kind of pieces that looked maybe a little bit like stained glass or chandeliers, working with
oh,
that
cool.
translucent quality. But what started, I had a very bad dog at that time.
A bad dog.
He was so bad. His name was Poncho, and anybody who was bitten by him, I apologize. But he was so bad that I had to walk him when other dogs weren't around. So I would be doing these like 2 in the morning walks in Williamsburg, and there were still things on the street. He would find a chicken bone or step into something he shouldn't. So my eyes were always on the ground looking as he was sniffing around. And that's when I started to notice for nighttime recycling these colored jugs and bottles in the recycling for the plastics, because it
Ah,
would be dark and it's a little dreary and maybe kind of dirty on the streets, but then these bright colors out of the corner of my eye, I'd see them in the bags, and I'd be like, oh, what is this pink bottle? And it would be like, a recycled bottle of Mr. Bubble or something like that. And I was like, oh, well, maybe you could start to incorporate color into your work. I mean, color was something I've always been afraid of, selecting and choosing through painted surfaces or something like that. It just wasn't an approach. But this was an opportunity to really use color without having to think about it in that way. It was like, I call it found color because it's just available. It's like manufactured into the material, and it's so bright and enticing because
yeah.
it's like, for materials that were to be purchased in a store. So they had to really stick out on a store shelf. And that's kind of how it started. That's how I started
Huh.
collecting the bottles. That was just so um, available and easy because I had to walk him all the time at these really late hours. So nobody would see me, and there was nothing sort of embarrassing about it. Later, I started to collect, and still sometimes I do if I see something good in the daytime, with the IKEA bag full of things. And then I would notice that people would cross the street to avoid me or like not make eye contact. And I remember one time actually, I was coming back from installing a show, and one of the pieces hadn't fit. So it was still in the IKEA bag. And these plastic pieces just look like plastic detritus in a bag like that. I remember struggling to go through the turnstile at the subway, and somebody said, "Oh, honey, I'll swipe you in." She thought I was unhoused, and
Oh,
she swiped me in to let me in. And I thought, oh, what a moment this is, that somebody would help me, which I thought was tremendous and generous of this person. But also for them to have characterized me as somebody who was unhoused because I had had these bags of
right.
plastic with me. So the taboos of garbage, which I'm sure you're very familiar with, are very interesting culturally, like in
Yeah.
society. Concepts of, it's someone else's discard, which you know intimately because you've been working with these materials also for a very long time. But someone has no use for this item. It's either something that was intended to not be used, like the wrapping of a food item or something used temporarily, or it might have been something that has been lived with and used but is no longer of use to someone and they discard it. But then, we might find value in it because the material is so
Yeah.
workable.
No, it's
But
true.
there's
And
a
there is
taboo.
definitely a sort of a stigma about picking up trash.
Hmm.
It's like I have finally, so I do a lot of forest walks here, and I have
Yeah.
finally, well, for the last 2 years, I feel totally comfortable cleaning up the trash on my walks. Like I
Hmm.
carry a bag with me, and I used to hide it in my pocket. It used to be a little bag. Now I carry like a little, it's not a huge bag, but it's a bag that'll hold a couple of bottles because
Yeah.
sometimes I'll find nothing. Sometimes I'll just find a couple of wrappers, and sometimes I'll come up with a whole, like 5 or 6 bottles, plastic
Hmm.
bottles or something. So it's a bag that would hold something like that. And now I proudly carry it on my shoulder. I don't think of anything. Um, but cleaning up trash like on a city street,
Yeah.
I do pick up. I don't do like full cleanups. But I'll pick up if there's something really interesting to me. And
Yeah,
I
of
do
course.
feel self-conscious about it. I kind of like quickly, squirrel it away into my bag.
Hmm. It's true. I always laugh about it because when I go to work, when I go to the school, I walk to the subway and then walk back. And I remember this bad dog, his name was Poncho. So if he would find a chicken bone or pizza or something, I'd make sure he didn't get it, but then he'd remember on the walk later that day. And I find I do the same thing. Like I might see something on the curb and I'm like, that's fantastic, but I can't put it in my bag and take it to school with me, though sometimes I do. And I'm like, I'm just going to remember that for when I come home. And then just like he did, I'll look and I'm like, is it still there? Is it still there? And sometimes there's pretty fabulous things. So in North Williamsburg, I've been using umbrellas recently, and in North Williamsburg, there's a lot of pretty fancy umbrellas that I'll find on the sidewalk. So often I'll think, oh, is that umbrella still going to be there when I commute home? And then if I'm lucky enough and it's still there, I pick it up. So, but it's also a little bit of that taboo. Like I don't want to put it in a bag, take it with me on the subway, take it all the way to work, and then carry it home with me.
Right. Yeah.
So it is sort of an interesting approach. But it was funny when you were talking about this forest walk, because I was thinking about, growing up hiking and going out into the forest, like for a hike or kayaking or something like that. And I remember my parents were pretty strict and they'd always said, whatever you take with you, you can't leave a trace of anything
Hmm.
behind. And we would never see anything on a walk in the woods or anywhere else. But I think because so many more people are doing outdoor activities from when I was small, I think those habits aren't as in mind. So now, like I was back in December for a visit in Vancouver and I went on a walk and I was surprised there were wrappers and, the
Yeah.
garbage here and there in the forest. And it was a little bit disappointing, but I didn't actually pick it up. Actually, now that I think that we're talking about it, but it was surprising. And I think that might have been also what was so jarring when I first came to New York is how much garbage there was because it
Yeah.
would just be piled on the street, like at a scale that was so tall. And I
Yeah.
remember in Midtown, the garbage bags were silver. And I
Oh, they
just
were?
finished reading like Andy Warhol's diaries. And I was like, these are like, his silver helium filled pillows floating around a room. It's just like silver, the land of plenty. It's just like silver plastic garbage bags full of garbage on the side of the street. It's the scale of it, I think, that's so
Yeah.
overwhelming. It's like
It's
how
funny.
much there is.
I think in the defense of people who walk in the woods where I walk, these are
Yeah.
suburban woods, but it's literally like this little triangle. I don't know how many acres, but it's a triangle that's bordered by a major highway and two really major
Mm.
roads. So
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of the trash that I see, especially like bottles and things like that,
Yeah.
find that's usually old. It's not like fresh trash. It's trash that
Yeah.
I call has been wilding for a while. So I think that's kind of like gets blown in from
Yeah.
the highways because you see a lot of
Yeah.
trash along the side of the highways. The wrappers, clearly, candy wrappers and things like that that I find, or, hair ties and things like that. That's fresh.
Mhm.
People, I try to think of it as, sometimes you do miss a pocket or something falls out of the pocket and you don't even
Yeah.
notice. I know I've done it. So I try to be kind in my thoughts
Mm.
about this kind of trash when I find it.
Yeah.
But but I think it is more. I don't really go hiking out in the wilderness these days that much,
Yeah.
but I have certainly seen a lot more trash along the highways than I have when I was a kid. So I
Yeah.
think a lot of the trash gets into the forest there. I think people,
Mhm.
I don't understand why, but I think people do throw trash outside of their car windows.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. And I think that, when you think about waterways and breeze and traffic and the wind of the freeway or the roads, that is how a lot of it travels around,
Mhm.
like we might find it in these localized spaces because it's either collected for recycling pickup or on the side of the streets, but it does kind of, like you're describing, travel around by different means,
Yeah,
and it lands in places you might not expect.
yeah.
But I still go looking for it on the street because it's a really easy way to collect and pick up
Well,
stuff
sure.
because it's so concentrated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And plus, does it really get recycled? So if you're picking it out of somebody's recyclables, I think you're recycling it probably in a better way than it would be recycled if it went to a actual recycling facility.
No, it's true. And I think, this is sort of the challenge of it because I think word has gotten out somewhat that maybe these things aren't recycled as well. And then it feels a little defeatist and people sort of throw their hands up and give up on it anyway because they're not sure.
Yeah,
Um,
that's
I
true.
did travel, I did take a tour of the recycling facility in Sunset Park. I don't know if you've ever been there.
I have an artwork that hangs in there actually.
Oh, that's fantastic. And that is sort of instructive to see, like
Yeah.
how the materials come in and maybe um, are very complex in the way that they've been sorted, and maybe they're not completely sorted accurately, but the machinery, divides the materials into the spots they might be. And there was a time in the city where it felt like that was more activated. Now I'm not sure, you know,
Yeah.
because the need for these recycled materials or the market doesn't demand it as much anymore. You
No, it
know,
really doesn't. That's the whole problem right there with the
yeah,
recycling. Yeah.
no way to pay for it or sell
Yeah.
it or what
Yeah.
the impetus is. So it's a little bit challenging in that way.
Yeah. I think it's a lot challenging, not even a little bit. Oh, it's a lot challenging. So, did you, when you first started using the plastic in your art practice, you weren't thinking about it from the environmental standpoint, were you? You were just, it was just an intriguing material for you?
It was just available. There was
Yeah.
so much of it. Like it's always scale with me in making work. Like, how can I make something really, really of a scale that you can encounter when you're looking at a work of art? I like it to sort of be relational to the body. So some kind of body size, just so it's in the space of the viewer.
Hmm.
Not really intimidating, but so that you can sort of activate it. And it's always a challenge to have enough material at a reasonable cost to make big things. So that's why I liked it because again, it was so much material that I could use enough of it to create an object that was big enough to really command a sense of space. And
Hmm.
that's why I started. And I think the other um, aspect about it is that it's fairly easy to process. So I could use um, X-Acto blades to cut it. I'm a little reluctant to do that now because I've had a couple of stitches visits.
Yes. Yes.
So I sort of use a different type of scissor now, but it's very easy to manipulate and
Hmm.
it's very easy to put together without needing technology or activating the chemistry of the plastic. So no
Oh,
heating.
so how do you put them together?
I just drill holes through that plastic and I attach it with a nut and a bolt,
Oh, okay.
like a hex nut and a bolt. And on a smaller piece, I just use wire. So I puncture it with a small hole, almost like a hole punch tool, and then I just put wire through it and hold that together. And in some ways, for that material, if the piece um, finds another life, it can go back to recycling if need be. So,
Right.
if it's lived out its life as an art object, or maybe I don't have space for it or change my mind about it, I can recycle it again.
Hmm.
And that's an advantage because making artwork often you may have objects or materials that at one time were very invested in, or you've exhibited them, or you wanted to keep, and then you might do a little bit of reorganizing in the studio and decide this piece has sort of lived its life and I
Hmm.
need some more space. And it's very freeing to be able to just return it back to the recycling um, cycle in a
Right.
way where, as with some of the other works I was making before, that was very hard to do because they couldn't be easily recycled, and then you've sort of produced another item that might be a discard or garbage. And I think
Right.
as an art maker, that's challenging because, the value of an artwork is quite subjective, especially early in art making. So you sort of are burdened with this concept that you're adding more
Yeah.
to the
Yeah.
cycle, and that's
Right.
always a challenge in that way.
Yeah. It's either storage or it's, yeah, what do you do with it if it's no longer wanted?
Yeah, so it's another object taking up space. But the plastic is very easy to work with, and um, it's very light also. So you
Yeah.
could make something at quite large scale and not have to worry so much about the weight of it.
Yeah,
And that's
that's
been
true.
a real advantage. Some of the pieces I've been making, like uh, the work I made in the show we had at SVA, was quite long. I think it's like 15 feet
Yeah.
long.
So I
And
have a funny story about that piece. I
oh
was
yeah, okay.
I was bringing my work for delivery
Hmm.
to before they were hanging it, and I'm walking down the street, and my work, it's plastic, it's light, but it's a little
Yeah.
cumbersome. So I had bags hanging off both of my shoulders. So I'm sort of walking ahead pretty straightforward, and then I see these people walking ahead of me, and I see that they're also carrying something on their shoulders, and I'm like, but I don't understand what it is. And it was wrapped in a blue bag, but it was a man and a woman, and they were walking one ahead of the other with this really
Hmm.
long thing on their shoulders just down 10th Avenue. And I was like, hmm, I don't know who that is, but I'm going to bet they're delivering artwork to plastic culture. And
Yeah, it
then I
was pretty
finally
amazing.
caught up to them at the loading dock, and it was Aurora and her husband, and they were carrying your work.
Oh, that's so sweet. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, because I don't work with anyone else, like I don't have anyone that helps me in the studio. So I think even though the scale is quite large, I can move that work by myself.
Yeah.
And so there's a freedom in that too, of not having to rely on really extra ways of moving the work around. So that's been an advantage of using plastic. It's very
Yeah,
light.
definitely. Well,
Yeah.
so, um, so you never use paint. You just use the color as is, right?
Yeah, I never adjust the color and I don't change the surface. That was something um, ingrained in me from undergraduate school, that it wasn't appropriate to put a skin on a sculpture.
Oh, really? Interesting.
Yeah, so it was a very strict kind of formal aesthetic that I learned under, which was pretty awesome. We had a professor who had studied under Anthony Caro in England, and then, had come out to the West Coast, and Roland Brenner, and he was very particular about the aesthetics and the approach to using materials. So I never change the surface of a found material. I always keep the integrity of it as it is.
Hmm.
And the advantage of the plastic is that it comes in so many shades. And even though I usually work monochromatically, so a red sculpture will only be made up of red bottles, or a blue sculpture will only be made up of blue bottles, all the color is as they were found. So I just clean them and cut off all the labeling so that you don't really see that, and then put them back together again in a way that kind of transcends its original shape. So I think when you look at the work a little more closely or spend time with it, you can see what the original material was. But I think at first encounter and first glance at the artwork, you don't necessarily get a sense of what it's made out of. So a lot of times people ask me, how did you get the color, so bright or so vibrant? And then I say, well, I just explained that it's the original material. And that's a lot of times when people start to recognize the branding and the bottles because they're
Mm.
so known to people.
Yeah.
A lot of these items are from the home, so a vinegar bottle or bleach bottle or maybe a detergent bottle of a brand that they recognize, and then right away they're just pulled right into the work, and there's sort of like a sort of humorous realization of what all the materials are, and then the scale of it because they use hundreds of bottles in each piece. So then that's kind of the ultimate underlying
Mhm.
realization is that there's so much plastic and so much
Yeah.
material.
So your work sort of took an environmental turn sort of organically, I guess.
Yeah, I guess out of necessity, it's always been in the back of my mind because when I first came to New York, there wasn't a recycling system. And in Vancouver and Victoria, it was already well into play. It had been
Mm.
going on for years that you had to curbside recycle and manage your trash in that way, and ultimately pay if you had too much. So every household was limited to a certain size.
Hmm.
And if you had more than that amount in the weekly pickup, you had to pay for it. So it was quite um, paramount in my mind when I arrived, but there was no means of recycling anywhere in New York. I came in the mid 90s and it wasn't in play yet. And it came so late. So um, it always made me somewhat uncomfortable because of the volume of garbage.
Hmm.
Um, so I guess it was in the back of my mind, but I hadn't thought about it in that particular type of way.
Right.
And that only emerged as I started to make the work
Hmm.
and then realized that it was sort of a commentary on that, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Yeah,
know it's an excellent commentary on that. Yeah.
yeah, exciting.
Yeah. So I have a technical question. I know that
Mhm.
you do quite a bit of outdoor sculpture as well, right?
Yeah.
How does that sturdy plastic hold up outdoors?
I have one sculpture that's now probably 10 years old outside. So it's outside still. And most of the plastic has not changed whatsoever, not
Wow.
in color or shape. And it's through the seasons because, on the East Coast, we have all the seasons. So it can be
Hmm.
extremely warm. The plastic becomes quite malleable and soft, and it might adjust its shape. And then it gets really cold through the seasons and it contracts a little bit and it might crack here and there. But for the most part, a lot of it's still intact, which is absolutely horrifying.
Yeah.
But
And you
some of
don't
the
put anything
bottles,
on it, like you don't put resin to make it sturdy in
no, I
any.
don't adjust the material at all. And
Yeah.
there are some bottles that break into pieces. So we hear a lot about how the plastic never goes away, but it gets into smaller and
Yeah.
smaller pieces. So some of
Hmm.
it cracks and becomes brittle and then breaks down into smaller pieces. And then I guess that's ultimately what finds its way into the water systems and
Right.
into the drainage and that. So
And
that,
into our bodies.
yeah, into our bodies for sure. And into the bodies if you're consuming, things that also eat plastic, like fish,
Yeah.
it's quite common.
Yeah.
But yeah, it doesn't deteriorate that
Mhm.
much.
That's impressive, shall we say?
Yeah, impressive. Like it's great to show outside because that can be an all season sculpture that you don't
Yeah.
need to really concern yourself with, and the color will stay vibrant.
Yeah,
Um,
even the sun doesn't really bleach it, does it? Huh?
Not so much. I mean, there's certain types of the Tide bottles bleach out and they really change color, but they don't deteriorate. So there's
Yeah.
something that's not quite light fast about the red that they use, but red is a challenging color, I think, for most materials. So that's not light fast, but all the greens and blues and yellows, they don't change at all.
So fascinating. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean I haven't experimented with those kind of heavy duty plastics, shall we say, for
Mhm.
outdoor sculpture, but I have with the soft plastics, and I know that that deteriorates much faster. Like I can't really have it outside for more than 2, 3 months tops. It does
Right.
start to
Yeah.
disintegrate, unfortunately. So, and I
Mhm.
certainly don't want to add more tiny trash to the environment.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
true. But
Yeah.
for the interior pieces, they hold up, right?
Totally
Like,
fine. I have pieces that are more than 10 years old and there's nothing, no
yeah.
change whatsoever.
It-
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting about longevity in artwork because, of course, in art movements where the final product, it's not necessary for it to be, a forever material. It doesn't matter as much, if you think
Hmm.
about sculptures that deteriorate over time. So it's always a bit of a conundrum there also, like, does it have to be an object that lives forever and
Right.
sticks around forever, or is it okay to have something maybe that existed for public viewing a couple of times and then might just be recycled again? So that's something I think about also, the permanence of it, um, and if it has to be permanent for so long.
Yeah. Do you repurpose some of your, well, I think you said you do. You repurpose some of your older sculptures into newer things sometimes, right?
Yeah, I can disassemble them and reassemble them, and that's a moment sometimes when I edit. If the material has changed too much
Hmm.
or if the bottle is deteriorated, then I put it in the recycling and send it back out. But often, because the hardware is kind of expensive, the hex nuts and bolts, the acorn nuts I use. So I repurpose that, but some of it rusts also and it's not able to be reused, but then I can just put it in recycling. So it
Right.
feels a little bit easier to manage rather than having to work with other types of materials.
And when you do your standing sculptures, like it's the
Yeah.
plastic is light, what do you use to anchor them?
Yeah, those are usually anchored on tomato planter supports that I
Oh,
find in recycling. So a lot of times those, I don't know, they're welded together. Like, it almost looks like the Deschamps piece where you had the water bottle drying rack, the bottle drying rack, but it's like an upside down tree shape.
hmm.
And it's three circles usually and three strips of wire. And usually people put them in the recycling because the weld has cracked apart.
Uh-huh.
And so I collect them out of recycling and use those. And I kind of use that as an internal armature to
Oh,
help
cool.
support. And then the base is usually a tire that I've picked up from the road.
A tire. Oh my God. Wow.
Yeah, because the car tire is quite substantial in terms of its stability. When you lay it
Yeah.
on its side, it's very stable. And then I can anchor the tomato planter internally, and it's a completely invisible structure. So it's malleable and easy to work with without having to use welding or heat. And it's all mechanical. I can just drill and use hex nuts and bolts. And then that can
That's
also
so
come
cool.
apart again. Yeah, so that's what, those are the moments where I'm a little bit like, rolling a tire down the side of the road to my studio. Like those are moments where I'm like, I don't know about this, but it's been okay. I don't do so much work with those, but um,
I suppose you can stop by an auto body shop and say, "You got any tires you're throwing out?" I
yeah,
bet
you're
they
saying
do.
they do, but there is a resale market for that. So that's
Oh.
also like, yeah, it's surprising. They don't always willingly, if it's totally stripped bald and can't be redeemed, they will do that. But
Uh-huh.
a lot of times, because the economic tide is shifting, that a lot of those tires get repurposed and reused
Oh, wow.
and repaired, which is kind of amazing.
Yeah, that is kind of amazing. Oh, that's so awesome.
It's fun.
Um, so I have a heavy duty question for you as we
Okay.
are nearing towards the end of this um, conversation. What do you think is the artist's role in fighting plastic pollution or climate change, or does an artist have a role?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's sort of why I came to the content component of the work a little bit organically, because I don't really have a sense that artwork needs to sort of engage in that type of way, in an overt way. I think
Mm.
that, that concept of the artist exploring the world and seeing something and then sharing that observation with a larger audience is sort of core of my practice. So I don't necessarily think that it's overt in that way in terms of environment. But I do think, it's curious, especially teaching art history, because, the output of a culture is really its cultural output. Like the artistic artifacts are what remain of any culture. So if we're looking at ancient Egypt or ancient Greece and Rome, or even the Renaissance, and, afterwards, if you think about post-war American art, those are the things that we sort of understand culture through as we look back. So they're helpful in that kind of way as a record or communication. And oftentimes when you look at that contextually, you understand maybe more of a political moment or a message. So environmentally, I think it's tricky and it's a challenge because you have to house the work. A museum has to store it maybe in climate control.
Right.
It has to be transported. The art fairs are environmentally disastrous. Everybody flies to them, and the work has to be sent there, and then the booths have to be set up and taken down. So there is like a very wasteful component to the industry, even packing materials and how things are arranged. So it's a challenge to be participating in it. Again, it feels inevitable, like the way we spoke about at the start of the conversation, because the plastic is everywhere. It's hard to avoid. And if you're kind of engaged in a practice as an artist, it's a challenge. But I think in all the ways possible, I try to be as low of a carbon footprint as I can. So, I don't own a car, and I'm very fortunate that my friends are nice enough to help me go from place to place if need be. And I'm not using materials that use a lot of generate a lot of electricity use and that type of thing. So I suppose like the way that an artist's practice is a way that they could exercise their environmental concerns or interests. But it's a challenge. I think if you're an artist working at a large scale and you're known, the demand is usually that you engage in practices that might not be as positive for the environment.
Yeah.
Such as casting a work in bronze or any other type of, I don't have the luxury of those concerns at this moment. But my thought is this, in a hopeful way to maybe think about it towards the end of the conversation, is that up until now, I have banked my carbon footprint as minimal as possible so that when the opportunity comes and I need to spend my carbon tax, I will have a lot in the bank.
I like that.
Up until now, it's been very low key, and I haven't had to fly all over the world to exhibit the work and ship it into big places and cast it at a large scale. But hopefully, all of the good environmental will that I've expressed to this point will help me when those times come.
I'm sure that they will. Wow.
But
Well,
yeah, I think, as somebody who's working with this materials, it's top of mind, really, of thinking about that.
yeah, I think it's impossible not to think about these things when you work with materials such as this, because you're
Maybe
learning more and more about it as you go.
Yes, that's true. And I think, on a sort of upbeat component of that, if you make things that are of aesthetic interest to people, I mean, I know saying something's beautiful might be controversial for some, but if you're creating objects that people might want to exist with or live with, that's an advantage too, because you can, bring joy to people. So if somebody has a work in the house or they exhibit the work and it brings pleasure to some people, I think that's also some kind of like a buoyant way to look at it in
It
the
is,
end.
and I think it's valid too, because,
Mhm.
I think we all need beauty in our lives.
Yeah, absolutely.
We totally do. Otherwise, things start to be very bleak.
Yes. Yes. So I'm grateful to people who work in that way. And the work that you exhibited in the plastic sculpture show, I thought was so stunning and beautiful. I didn't
Oh,
really
thank you.
understood when I first looked at it that it was plastic. I didn't understand, it was so transformed that I didn't really know what the material was. And I think if you can do that as an artist with your materials and introduce that back into somebody's environment or their home or their kind of experience. It's really a joy. It's like a gift to be able to transfer that to
Oh,
other people. So I hope that we can inspire at least that component of it for others, you know?
yeah, I'd like to think so.
Yeah.
I'd like to think that we're piquing other artists' interests in materials such as these.
Hmm.
And I think most artists probably like a challenge.
Yeah.
And maybe they will take on a challenge of using a piece of trash from the sidewalk
Right.
and transforming it into something really beautiful.
Mm.
So it's a
Yeah.
challenge. I put it out there for everyone.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Like, how can you do it differently? You
Yeah.
know? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Nikki. This has been a delightful conversation.
Yeah, it's been very fun to chat. Thanks for
Yeah.
asking me. It's been really exciting. And
Yeah.
hopefully we'll show again sometime soon
I hope so too.
together. That would be
Yep,
really great.
that would be awesome.
Yeah.
That was such a wonderful conversation. I am so inspired by Nikki's practice, and I hope you will take the time to look at all the links and check them out yourself and maybe even see some of the sculptures in person. Thank you again for listening. Please rate and review and comment and share and all that jazz. Thanks so much. See you next time. This podcast was created, produced, and edited by me, Natalia Korover. Theme music by R.C. Gaida. To find out more about me, go to artbynatalia.com. To find out about my community, go to repurposercollective.com. And to learn with me, check out all my offerings at ecoloop.art. Thank you for listening.